Should we just call it 2:30? Okay. Okay, everybody. Thanks for joining me. I'm really glad to see so many people in the room, and especially the ones in the aisles who are clearly prepared to storm the stage and give me a hard time, Patrick. This is a talk that I gave a couple of months ago at an OWASP chapter meeting in Austin. And I got such great feedback from it that I thought I would, take it on the road and run it by you guys. This is a concept that I'm playing with, and I would really like your input on it. First, a little thing about where I come from. I work for 451 Research, which is part of the 451 group. Cover what we're calling the digital infrastructure, which is everything from power all the way up through the app, to the users. So we have groups that do physical data center tier certification. We cover the cloud. We do end user spending research. We do consumer spending research. Everything digital, pretty much, we cover a lot. And we recently bought the Yankee Group, which I'm sure a lot of you guys know here. Do I have any Yankee Group colleagues in the audience? Oh, too bad. I was hoping to meet some today. But what's really important, and the sales guys will be happy that I tell our CEO that I plugged the company. But what's really, really important is that more people feeding into our research. We are looking for end users to interview, to ask what you're buying and why in areas like network storage, security, and so on. And in return, you get some free data in the form of reports back. So if you have interest in doing this, please go to this URL, sign up, tell them Wendy sent you, and I'd be really grateful, because we're always looking for people at your level to talk about trends. Now, what's the chemistry of data? This is something that I was making up. I started first by talking about what I call data events. And this is where the data itself is in use. The data, or actually it doesn't even have to be in use. The data does not change. It is some sort of context around it, something that it's being used for. Something in the environment changes, and it changes all the security requirements around the data. So, for example, a press release, completely confidential. You might have your DLP cranked up to check for any mentions going out of Project Biscuit, until suddenly the decision is made, the business decision now has to be publicized as widely as possible. So your DLP system is going to be making sure everybody is sending it out and mentioning Biscuit as often as possible. And the only difference here is that this is a business decision. Okay, go. But the problem is that a lot of our security controls aren't built to adapt to this kind of switch. So, for example, a doctor becomes a patient. See, like that. Doctor, patient. I'm really bad at graphics. Her name, according to HIPAA, is confidential, but as soon as she becomes a patient, then her name is confidential. It's the same name. Everything, context is what really matters. A student flunks a test. I used to work for the Texas Education Agency, and we had to deal with FERPA compliance. Now, short of directory sort of information, which is okay, any other information that can be used to identify an individual student is considered confidential. So any kind of information, longitudinal, the number of left-handed Swedish exchange students in Paris, Texas, anything like that. So in some cases, if everybody passes a test except for 1, 2, 3, or 4 students, then suddenly that 4-student sample size becomes unacceptable. And this person in the hoodie reminds me of my daughter. She walks around like that all the time. She's 13. And that can lead to a lot of messy situations with data. So we had a lot of data analysts in the agency whose job it was to figure out whether what we were required to share contained anything that was going to be a violation of FERPA. Now, stripping out SSNs is pretty easy, but when you start putting that sort of statistical data together at any given time, a student transfers from one district to another, and suddenly, the sample size gets all wonky. They would have to sanitize the data to give it out to research. And strange things happened. Our commissioner was accused of banning pizza parties at schools. It was all in the papers and headlines and everything. Everybody got very exercised about it. The problem was that some school proposed having a pizza party for the kids who passed the state assessment tests. And the problem was that given the number of students, you could then identify the kids who had not passed because they were doing something like listing the names of the kids who had passed or something like that. So he said, I'm sorry, but you can't do that. You can't single out the students in that way. And it turned into the commissioner hates pizza parties. So I'm calling the chemistry of data the use or the potential use, and this is going to be important later, data that determines its security state. So for example, again, stripping out SSNs from what we were mandated by the state to send to researchers, they would go out and go back to the districts and collect the SSNs from there and re-weaponize the data that we had spent all this time sanitizing. So you can do this sort of thing, and of course, everybody knows examples of people who are putting together different types of data and coming out with something that's potentially explosive, or very, very sensitive. Combining data elements that change the classification. The military knows about this very well. It happens all the time. Any sort of geographic data, weather data, deployment, personnel data that could be put together to identify where troop movements were going or something like that can suddenly become confidential. Or just, in mandatory access control, one type of data rubbing up against another type of data imbues it magically with the higher level of classification. I love this guy. Everybody uses this guy, but I still love him. Now, as we've been talking about, and there was some discussion of it today in the keynote, that people are making particular uses of data in ways that create problems today that we did not experience before or couldn't have foreseen. Another example from TEA was that one of the news outlets made a Public Information Act request for all the salaries of the employees, which is perfectly legal to do. And it was delivered to them. What they did, though, was they created a database and published it so anybody could look up individual salaries. And it had employees' names and tied into it. And that started creating problems because for one person who feels they're not being paid enough can look up their coworker. It created a big stir. And the problem was not that we shouldn't have released the data. We absolutely should have. But from my perspective, it would have been just as useful without the names, but with particular job classifications or titles listed, so you could see, there's one person in a commissioner position and he's getting paid this amount of money. That would have told you, the public, what they needed to know, what they wanted to know. If they wanted to know where their dollars are being spent on salaries for different levels of employees, that would have worked fine, and it would not have engendered, the sort of HR crises that managers have to deal with.
The challenge with that is that if the commissioner is the lowest paid of 4 others, that
Yeah.
makes more money than you do.
Exactly. If it's broken up by agency, then you absolutely know. Yeah. That's the other problem. And then just about everybody knows, after the Sandy Hook massacre, the news outlet that published the names and addresses of gun permit holders. Again, that was public information, but not public, if you get my meaning. It was publishing it in a certain context after a massacre was something that's made that same data much more sensitive to the gun permit holders, and politically sensitive, across the board. So again, it was the particular use of that data that changed its classification, and suddenly public data was, we'd rather it not be public or not spotlighted that much. What we're used to in our society is the right not to be singled out. And that's it. If somebody wants, if I have my GPS enabled and, I'm walking around, I know that I have it enabled and somebody could look, but I'm trusting that somebody's not actually trying to look, and especially that they're not trying to do it for a nefarious purpose. And these are the assumptions that we make when we enable this sort of data. Now, whether this is a reasonable assumption or not anymore is something, that we need to think about. So you got your data scientist at work here. It's kind of funny, when all of your product names start sounding like sound effects, I think it's a problem for our industry. So every business or any organization has certain types of data formulas, combinations of data that mean something to them, that have business implications, that have process implications, context implications, things that are well known inside of the organization but that would be inappropriate to publish outside, and so on. So I wanted to spend time thinking about the sort of formulas that you have. In our case it was students with SSNs or with other types of individually identifiable elements that when you put them together in the right way could create a problem. So we would say this, this column plus this column plus this column with 4 or more rows is a bad combination and you can't do it and we can't send it out. So I'm sure that people have this, organizations have these, they're just not thinking as explicitly about them. The other question is, when you're sharing data with a partner, can you, certainly there's a lot of discussion about what you can use it for. Yes, you can't use it for marketing. But can we say that data is going to be corrosive if you pair it with, this sort of data from the outside, and you cannot do that? And make that a legal part of the agreement to say these are the sorts of data you may not use this for or combine with this data that we're giving you. Again, it's a very nascent thought, but I'm trying to reach something here, and I'm hoping you guys can help me. The other thing, and this is going to be highlighted even more in Jake Koontz's talk later on, what I call the principle of least use. And this is completely opposite to big data. Right now it's like, collect it all. We'll sort it out later. We'll figure out, is your data bigger than mine? Whoever has the biggest is the studliest or something like that. But really, what I used to do when I was doing architecture reviews was to say, do you really need to collect this data? Do you need to collect zip codes? Why do you need to collect zip codes? And they'd say, well, I don't know, it's just part of the whole address entry that we got from another database. It's like, well, throw that out if you don't need it, or don't ask the user to put it in if you don't need it. How many people know of applications where there is an explicit cleanup function in it? In other words, getting rid of or expiring data that you no longer need. Has anybody heard of this happening? No, we just keep collecting and collecting. If we're lucky, we archive stuff off to backup tape, but the intentional cleaning of data is something that we don't do. So, principle, least privilege, separation of powers, and least use is something that I think we should start talking about in the community so that, we don't make the hobbit unhappy. Here's some other examples that you probably know or have thought of, ways to abuse data. Even withholding data until after it's expired, in the trading environment, very bad. It could also, when you know that there's a particular deadline that will change the value of that data, holding it until then, or releasing it, to bad effect. Putting false data in. How many people, when you sign up for something or you order something and they ask for your address, like a magazine subscription, how many of you intentionally misspell your name or use a different version of your name? I know you do, Andy. Yeah. Use Josh's. Excellent. That's why you're getting that. Yeah. all those catalogs. Yeah, so um, it's kind of fun to do that and to see, to track over years where that data is being reshared, because this is beaconing, you know, if you like, or it's marking where you gave that original data. My parents' dead cat, who has been dead for 20 years, is still getting retirement home ads at my house. Through a really strange confluence of when we came back to Texas from abroad, and we hadn't bought a house yet. We stayed with my parents. I think I gave their address when we signed up for the mortgage. And then from there, it found its way, you know, mortgage information is very hot. It got shared around, and so at some point then, when my change of address got into a list, they decided my parents were then living with me, and so, you know, that's why I'm now getting my parents' dead cat on envelopes. But that brings up the question as to whether we should be doing that, whether we should be intentionally corroding data about ourselves in order to frustrate too much collection. That's another thing that would probably give some people heart attacks, and some people would see it as, you know, an act of rebellion against the state or something like that. You can undermine trust in the data without ever changing it, just by changing, you know, reputations around it, putting out false information that affects the description of that data. Of course, you know, we all know the bad things you can do with statistics. You can cut yourself and other people with them. Or, you know, just expanding the volume of data so that you can hide something in it. It doesn't even have to be a denial of service attack. It can be a concealment attack, not necessarily steganography, but if you know what they're processing and what they're looking for and you want to slip something in under the radar, if you give them enough to chew on somewhere else, you may be able to distract from other data that you're holding in storage. So I was thinking about how do we do this, because again, controls, short of, you know, the high-level analytics and statistical modeling that people are starting to do, we're not really looking at the data itself. We're threat modeling the applications, which is kind of the pipe through which the data goes. But we're not really doing too much threat modeling on the data itself. How can it be used? How can it be misused? And again, which combinations could be hazardous? And when the risk of holding that data outlives its usefulness. And over to you, Jake, at 5 o'clock. You'll be talking about when big data becomes a liability. And here's where you guys come in, because Boston is one of the smartest cities I know, and I've got a room full of really, really smart people, and so you probably have answers that I don't. So the question is, how do we adapt security controls to take this sort of thing into account? I'm sure people are actually working with this problem even if they don't know it.
So one of the first things we do acknowledge that you can't actually anonymize data sets.
You can't actually anonymize data sets. Say more about that.
We're not smart enough to anonymize data sets. Somebody can always reconstruct it.
Mm-hmm.
If you begin from an assumption, you can implement security controls to anonymize the data set and share it. That's your first mistake.
That's kind of like, you know, pseudo-random number generators. Yeah, that aren't. Yeah, Patrick.
No, I won't vouch for these guys. I will take a little exception with that statement. There's a whole department at the Census Bureau, because I got into a project like this of super specialized statisticians whose discipline is scientific anonymization of data. I didn't even dream that something like that could exist until somebody asked me to look into it. Now, to speak to his point, whether they're effective or not, I can't say, but they do exist, and it is an academic discipline, and it's about as esoteric as some of the stuff information security people do at Assembly Line.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, they probably are. Even, yeah, they're probably less popular than security people.
It's got a name too, but it doesn't come to mind. That discipline of statistics. So recognize it.
Yeah, so anonymization And the question is, how do you prove that anonymization? How do you, it almost sounds like you're trying to prove a negative.
Well, you can create anonymity sets that you can determine that somebody is part of that set, right? So that's, there's a bunch of anonymity theory around that. But if you want to be able to say, here's a record for an individual, but I have anonymized it, you're more likely to fail than to succeed. In the same fashion that people can write crypto, right? I'd be surprised if there's anybody in this room who can't. And I know and employ several of them who are on that borderline.
Probably could, given enough
And
Ritalin.
they're smart, and generally they're smart enough not to.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah, when Netflix released its, anonymized viewing data, the people who took that compared it against IMDb comments and were able to take any given individual, and if they had used IMDb, was able to map them to that and say, oh, well, you rated, Star Wars and Star Trek, but you didn't rate Debbie Does Dallas when you rented that from them.
That's true.
Well, a lot of it comes from the things that you can't hide in the data, right? So if, going back to the educational piece, just revealing that somebody has a score tells you that here's this person, they're within this age range most likely, they live in this particular part of the country, they're alive right now, right? There's this whole long list of things that you get, and you can't remove that. You can't remove those other factors from that, and those provide correlation into other things.
Yeah, that there will always be, it seems, another set of data that you could potentially put together, to resharpen the image, no matter how much you try to blur it.
We did this at a previous company that I was at. Does not do this any longer, but at the time was operating a system that collected information from various websites, and it had an engine for correlating information. If you entered information to one of our customers and a different set of information for another one of our customers, we could tie back and build in reports across what you were doing. And we had customers that paid for this. We had a customer in the automotive space, just on their own site, that if you went in and asked for information about a particular vehicle, it would come back, and the person who looks at the request that came in also gets to look at every vehicle you looked at after having sent the request. Right?
Interesting.
It's really easy to correlate that data just from logs. And the steps people take to try to anonymize it, I wouldn't trust myself to do it successfully.
Yeah. And ironically enough, the other problem that we had at the Texas Education Agency was actually getting the right student identified. And the reason for that is, first of all, in any given city that's large enough, there are going to be a certain number of kids that are born on the same day, so they have the same birth date. In several cultures, it's traditional to name the child after a saint, of that day or whatever. And there are a lot of common last names. So you may have a bunch of different Maria Alvarez entries in your database. The other thing is that even SSNs aren't necessarily individual. There will be a lot of families that will just have one and they'll pass it around. Oh, your little brother's going to school and he needs to give an SSN to the registrar. Here's your sister's, just go put that in. So going back and then trying to clean that data, certainly you can't do it centrally because you don't have enough external information to be able to narrow it down. It's, the person at the campus, the registrar who's at the desk in the office, who looks over at the kid and asks, okay, who's your mom, who's your dad, where are you living, to try to clean up that entry in the statewide student database. So it kind of goes both ways. It's never precise enough when you need it, and it's too precise when you don't want it to be.
Yeah, I think I was talking about this a couple weeks ago, but so we're doing a lot of internal fleet telematics type data, so not customer stuff, but internal fleet stuff. And they're getting, I got meetings here that you know we're talking about it. I love it out there. And I think I was talking about it, we're putting those into private cloud-based storage, but it's still cloud-based storage for analytics, like all that you talked about before. And it's not, so we're not storing addresses, we're not storing date of birth, we're not storing their social security. So we're not storing what we would traditionally call sensitive data. But I can tell you that Alan speeds a lot if you get
Right.
Where are they processing that data? How are they processing it? What are they doing for anonymizing if that is even a thing? And how bad is it if that were to be a breach of there? You know, what downstream potential does that have? So we're struggling with a lot of the same questions you're asking.
Yeah, Josh.
What's your there for? Are you trying to say that DLP is pointless?
Actually, from my perspective, and apologies to any vendors in the room, DLP has always been pointless to me, because even just putting a simple mail filter on for social security numbers, let us identify typoed phone numbers really well, and also court docket numbers. Really good at identifying those. So yes, there's a lot of talk about, yes, we can put together context, but if humans can't foresee and put together all the formulas, all the data formulas, how are you going to configure that into a DLP? So that's the sort of thing that, again, you see a name going by, wait, was that the doctor or was that the patient? What was it? What was that data bound to? Who was it coming from? Who was it going to? Because sometimes it's mandated information that you have to send out. A lot of the problems for organizations is not whether to let something out or not. It's finding the right partner to share it with, and they have to be able to tell the difference. Their business is sharing data, they just have to make sure they're doing it right.
Is there any value at all in tracking where the data flows, not preventing like IDS versus IPS?
Tracking the horses after they've gotten out of the barn?
For knowing who's touched this?
Yeah.
This is used in the real estate industry very heavily for newspapers and websites that run real estate listings. Is they'll inject false listings into their ads, into their system that will only be found by bots. So when a competitor scrapes and then publishes that listing, they can take legal action against the competitor. Right? They have no way to stop them. They're much more interested in letting them do it in a way that they can prove creates an issue.
Right. Patrick.
Two things. I did a little quick look on what they do at the Census Bureau. They actually create what they call synthetic data. So they'll look at a particular data set and they'll invent records as part of the anonymization process. Now, how well it works, I can't speak. The other thing I wanted to address is the notion of correlation, I think, is what drives some companies to keep everything. It's the thought or the hope or the belief that sooner or later we will have collected enough of the right stuff that we'll be able to correlate and answer questions that either we haven't thought to ask yet, or we're asking but we cannot come up with a correlation. Now, how in the world, and this is fascinating that
Yeah.
we're talking about, because we're talking about a level of abstraction off the data that is way removed.
Yeah.
And fantastically complicated even to talk about.
Yeah, but even if we start with a really simple example like the press release, there should be a way to be able to adapt controls so that, this doesn't go out until suddenly we need to send it out.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's the part that resonated with me the most, right? So I work in financial services IT, and there's data we absolutely cannot release until the 15th of the month.
Yeah.
And by the end of the quarter, that data has to vanish. So that very much resonated. But as I'm thinking about this, the problem is the controls, the technical controls are available in the report, on the delivery. Technical controls are not available on the data.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
How do you add an access control list to a tuple in a database?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the data have somehow to become intelligent enough, divorced from any kind of system that uses it.
Yes, exactly.
Somewhere in the metadata, something, there's got to be a kill switch or an expire flag, and maybe there's some analogies in the natural world or with medicine. That's the way I keep stuff that just goes away.
Yeah. Eric.
One of the ways people have tackled similar problems in the past, in programming language, you'll use things like type theory, or you'll use, some people talk about, you may have encountered the taint flag in Perl, right? That detects, this is user input, and you can track it that way. There was a talk at BASC last year or the year before about somebody who was doing this say.
Mhm.
So if you hit reply all on thread and, oh shoot, the customer was CC'd, you can stop yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
Things like that you can get out of that. Whether you're going to get something rigorous that's going to stop every possible leak, no.
Yeah, yeah. And the fallback for a lot of these, security controls today is, well, at least it stops stupid. And that's like the low bar. Yeah.
I'm not really familiar with involving with computing of classified information companies, but there was at least some old school stuff and maybe some stuff that's still occurring in the area of what's called multi-layered systems, which based just on, just glancing osmosis, seems to have these notions of labeling or data labeling. And I've seen that term being bandied about, but not been interested enough to investigate. But it seems to me that there's some kind of discipline that involves notions of labeling data with certain kinds of classifications, even if it's not, government secrecy classification. But is that, I'm just so unfamiliar.
Yeah, I don't know, with some sort of overlay, I almost imagine, one of those multi-page, clear drawings where you put one on top of another and then suddenly you have a whole picture.
There's stuff like Stop OS, different.
Yeah, BAE systems, yeah. Yeah, but the question is, with those sorts of systems, how much do they look into the data as opposed to the operations, the connectivity, the containment?
I think a lot of them rely on the user designation of classification. So it's more
Yes.
processing isolation.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be like a really negative person right now.
Go ahead.
Which is totally outside of character. We can't keep 16 digits safe.
Yeah, you're right.
And I'm sorry to steal something from him, but I mean we can't, right? I mean there was just like another grocery store chain that said 2.4 million lost.
Mm-hmm.
If we can't keep 16 stupid digits safe, how are we going to be looking for changes in pH? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
It seems like almost intractable right now if you think about that.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
And so the simple answer, and you'll almost never hear me plug CISSP except right now.
Stand back.
If you remember the CBK, this is answered in the CBK, the question about how you deal with multi-layer systems, which is the Bell-LaPadula model.
Right.
Which is a really trivial one. It basically says, if you have a tiered classification of systems, no hierarchy, straight tiering, then there's infection in one direction, not the other.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a piece of secret data and a piece of unclassified data, and you put them side by side, you have two pieces of secret data, and if you separate them, you still have two pieces of secret data. So machines can deal with it. It's really crappy from a data processing perspective because it's actually more about infection of data than it is about the context of the data.
But it doesn't stop WikiLeaks either.
It totally doesn't stop WikiLeaks.
I'm just like I'm sorry to be like the negative person here, right? It just
You're not.
it just
You're all
seems
shocked.
it just seems almost. I mean, I think it's a good discussion to have, and I think it's a 20-year maybe we'll get there kind of thing. But this just seems like it's like a 20-year we're going to get there kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because the problem is, even with some of the things we're talking about, there's models and whatnot. If you embed, all right, my system, we've now adopted the model you talked about, you talked about this system, your point, and my data is completely secure. I am fantastic on financials. And I put that data in a CSV file and I said it don't work. Now what?
Yeah.
Well, it's funny, but forget that. You print the report out, and it's still
You
on the
print the report,
and it's
you don't
still,
CR it.
yeah, or it's still on the stupid hard drive that the admin forgot to secure the thing for. So now it's like the image of it, so you can just grab it. I mean, it just seems like with all of our controls are so woefully inadequate to deal with just normal, let alone.
Yeah. And yet you're wrestling with it today, and so are you. Yeah.
A lot of the big financial services guys, this is why they went to highly virtualized desktops, and they started going back to mainframe type models. No one was really storing data; they were simply viewing data from a data class, a terminal. There are some vendors who just get a lot of popularity, like trusted by a company called BitArmor, and they could do some sort of DRM-ish stuff where after a certain time period, you can access the data anymore. I'm sure you can crack it if you want, but there are attempts to do something like just having the data proliferate less than it used to.
Yeah, or self-destruct. There's a company that advertises that. I can't remember the name. Yeah, that's our thing. Yeah.
What's really resonating with me is the choice of the word chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you think back 500 years,
Alchemy,
our understanding of chemistry was primitive.
Is that what it? Cool.
So, I mean, you're absolutely onto something. The fact that mainly what we have requested is hugely important. And I guess the question I want to put out for you and for the group is what really is the difference between code and what we're calling data? I mean, it's all a stream of bits and bytes. I guess it's an expectation of use that code will kind of go over here and do certain things in a set of processing registers, and somehow data will do something else. So would it be possible to add to a metadata header some type of execution stream? I'm just thinking out loud. I mean, if the data has to be self-preserving, self-executing, self-destructing, self-defending, then it can't really depend upon external code to make that happen, can it?
Yeah, and the other hang up is that users don't want to have meta thoughts about their data. They don't they just want to use it. They don't want to sit there and label it. That's why some classification companies are having trouble getting traction in the market. You don't want to think about that when you're doing your Word document. So that's the problem. At some levels of management, it is a concern. It certainly is a concern when something gets leaked, and they try to figure out how to keep it from happening again, but it turns out to be the only controls we can beef up are very mechanistic ones. So, I don't know.
I mean, talking about Word documents and free-form text and all that, that seems like, almost the holy grail. But what's already been discussed now a little bit is like some notions of programmatic structures, mechanisms like Perl heads, scheme checks, and so on. Improvements in database modeling or something along those lines, at least for the structured data, may help to provide an information infrastructure of sorts on which appropriate business logic and this is authorization data really that we're talking about, might be layered. So it seems like maybe the best areas of hope are these places where we already have structure.
Yeah, or even the question today, can and should DNA be patented? Or should it be open source? Well, it depends. Is it my DNA? Everybody likes to say information wants to be free, but usually you want the other guy's information to be free. You don't want your information to be free. So, all right, how are we doing on time? Are we running out here? Oh, okay. All right, we're good. Yeah, so obviously, there are lots of companies that cannot, even keep their firewall up and running. And this is not going to be a concern for them until later. But like I said, there are some companies that are struggling with this, but without a particular, way of encoding what you're talking about, how you're encoding the use. Maybe we are just getting good at securing data based on structure, but not based on content or context. So if you think about it, it used to be that you could tell what data belonged to the business by what it was created with. If you didn't have a PC at home and there was a Word document, it clearly belonged to the business because that's the only place where you could have created it. But today, you cannot identify it as business data by what application was used to create it, where it's stored, where it was created, what time, by whom. The only thing that you can, what device it's on, with all the mixed-use applications we have today and mixed-use devices, the only way you can tell what is business data is by actually looking at it and wrapping, the content around it. To be even more ridiculous about it, you could take all the words that are in a Word document, and depending on how you put them together, it could be either business related or it could be a personal love letter to somebody. Or maybe it's the kind of love letter that I write, but anyway. You're right. You're absolutely right. So, yes?
Would another framework of thinking about the not necessarily who or what created it, but what systems it's touched? So I know if it comes from, if it touches my email server, I'm going to wrap it around and say, okay, that's not corporate data. If it touches my file server, it's now
Yes and no, because again, if I sent a personal email through the corporate server, yeah, you can have the whole argument about whether it then belongs to the corporation. But there are lots of companies who use Gmail, so again, or if somebody has sent something to a Gmail account, there's the whole question of, can we retrieve our corporate data? Well, how can you tell what those are? Yeah.
This might be really thinking out of the box for me.
I would hope the MITRE person would do this, yeah.
And I don't know, or it could be just dumb. But we already have an infrastructure in place for kind of knowing what your data is, and it's signatures, cryptographic signatures, which are used for integrity, and maybe cryptographic signatures could be reused in a way to effectively serve as almost labeling data being associated with a particular organization or something like that. Now, of course, just even a simple, small modification of that data changes that invalid signature. There might be something in those kinds of mathematical mechanisms in the infrastructure that might be leverageable for a problem like this.
Yeah, you would still need the formulas, though. I mean, you could, in a way, tag this, but you'd have to specify the appropriate use of that data, and the appropriate use might be transporting it somewhere else, or it might be, communicating it verbally, or something like that. So I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, well, to extend that, so I'll extend it over. I was going to go for the thing I had. So that's great and all, but what if the Python library, like just happened with SSR, right? It doesn't check for specific verifications or it just doesn't care. So it's going to still process the data because it's going to ignore the fact that you did the verification to get things that's not supposed to be there. And is that where we need to attack this? Not so much from the geekhead security people doing the thing, but is it getting all these new fledgling data scientists that are coming up that are going to be the data architects probably back at their organizations ultimately, getting them to start thinking about it like, oh, our tools need to think about data this way and we need to start processing data that way. Because if you look at Hadoop, what it was just like last year is when you finally had the idea of permissions on the Hadoop file system.
Yeah, what a concept.
Like last year.
Yeah.
Hadoop's been around
Oh,
for a
yeah,
while.
yeah.
But think, it's like they finally, and that was only because somebody that made a proprietary version of Hadoop gave the back level back to the open source community. So I'm just wondering if they're the people that we need to be doing this, because if we make data too hard for the people that write the Python scripts to process it, as an example, we're not going to make the innovations that we have. So you've got that dichotomy between what the developers need to have progress and what we feel from the need to actually secure it because we have this new form of toxic data that we're building. And I think we actually need to attack it on that, the actual data people, the data architect side versus the data security people side.
Oh, interesting. Patrick?
Well, we kind of moved the discussion from where you started, I think. We've been talking about dealing with data as we know it. What you were really talking about is interactions between discrete sets of data where maybe nobody ever thought to look for a relationship, or it's like if you don't know anything about chemistry and you have a block of pure lithium like we stole out of a high school chemistry class one time and threw it in the creek, you don't realize until you do that lithium in water will make an explosion. You're talking about a really different layer of abstraction, and I mean, wow, it could be anything. It's not like we have a nice tidy system of atomic structures, chemical valences, and things like that where we know how some of these things interact. We're talking about almost totally unknown.
Yeah, and yet, on the other hand, it's like pornography. We know it when we see it. So that's the other thing. Well, Richard Thiem said this morning that one of the big problems that we have in security is defining the problem, and I think that's what we have here is a difficulty defining the problem, even though we know there is one. So hopefully, if you guys think of anything, feel free to give me a buzz, and I would love to hear any ideas that you have, because I think these are the sort of questions that sometimes we do get in analyst inquiry, and trying to figure out what to tell them is kind of problematic. But there's such a great brain trust here that I'm sure we'll come up with something. Anyway, thank you very much. This was a great discussion. Or hand them to me and I'll fill them out.